Joining me now is former Lib Dem Member of Parliament and ex-Transport Minister. It was a pleasure to be in the government with him back after the 2010 election. Thank you very much for joining us. Just on the question of this nationalisation, is it going to work?
Well, it's not going to be terribly helpful for a reason I'll explain in a moment, Jake. But the reality is, of course, that the railways are already renationalised to a large degree, and people don't necessarily understand that. Network Rail was nationalised, no one called it that, under the coalition government between 2010 and 2015. And the result of the pandemic has been to make the Department for Transport responsible for letting contracts and micromanaging what's going on in the railway. So it's really already happening to a large degree. And Labour's proposals this week, which were presented as being rather radical, actually build very much on the government's own white paper establishing Great British Railways. The one difference, coming back to your point, the one difference is that the model at the moment has the Department for Transport as the accountable public body setting the terms of how trains operate, the timetables, to some extent the fares and so on. And the private sector then handles it and delivers the contracts. And that's a model which is employed by the Mayor of London. London Overground is employed by Andy Burnham in Manchester for the buses. And London Buses works in that way. And where Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves and Louise Hay have gone one step further is to say that what will happen now is we'll take those private contracts away and we'll have them all run by a sort of new British Rail. And I think that's probably unhelpful. Not least of all because in the next 3 or 4 years, until the contracts expire, which is what the Labour policy is, why would any private sector company running trains bother to invest or do anything at all?
Well, quite right. And I also wonder all those other things run by civil servants are going so well. The NHS is absolutely tip-top at the top of its game. Things like the Passport Agency. Goodness me, I look forward to those civil servants getting hold back of the railways. It'll make my commute significantly better, apparently, according to the Labour Party. But what they have done, which is quite clever, is they've found a way to do this sort of article of faith for the left, which is renationalise as part of the railways, free of charge, they say. They say this won't cost the taxpayer a penny. You alluded to it there, saying that they're going to wait for these franchises to expire. Is that a reasonable way for them to look to do it in terms of delivering value for the taxpayer, Norman?
Well, I'm sure it's what Rachel Reeves has demanded, and it must be no net cost as a consequence of this, but there will be a cost because, as I say, the companies at the moment who are running the railways are doing some stuff off their own bat, off their own volition. They'll simply stop doing that because if you're faced with an execution order, why would you bother investing in the short term until the execution takes place? In addition to that, we've got something called a best price guarantee from Labour. Now, I'm not against a best price guarantee. I think it's quite a good idea. But does that mean that they're going to match the cost of, for example, split tickets? And you may know, Jake, that when you buy a ticket from A to B and B to C, it's cheaper often than buying one from A to C. Are they going to match that as a best price guarantee? Because if they do, that's going to cost quite a lot of money.
But why do we need the government to do that for us? There are apps out there. There are, the train companies themselves have apps, but there's one very well-known one called the Train Line, which does those split tickets. Why do we need the state to do it for us when people can just get an app on their phone, and most people have a smartphone in this country, and do it for themselves?
Well, I mean, the Train Line and others are quite good organisations, and I certainly use split ticketing sites myself and save quite a degree of money, as I imagine you do, on train travel. I suppose the argument is that if you're someone who is go to a booking office or is otherwise haven't got a smartphone, why should you pay more for a ticket than someone who has got one?
OK, well, I think there's quite a lot of validity in that argument. Tell me, their plans that don't include owning the rolling stock, though, or even investing in the rolling stock, just for because it's so complicated, just for our viewers and listeners at home, how does that currently work?
Well, at privatisation in the 1990s, the rolling stock, all the rolling stock owned by British Rail was hived up into 3 different private companies called rolling stock companies, or ROSCOs. And they now own all the trains, or nearly all the trains, and they are then leased back to the train companies or the Department for Transport in some cases, because the Department for Transport is running some lines like the East Coast Main Line itself now, and they pay a lease fee for those trains. Now, the rolling stock companies actually are the area where most money is being paid to the private sector. If you look at the profits from the rolling stock companies, they are absolutely enormous, as are the bonuses. So in a way, it's quite surprising the Labour Party, which goes on about money leaching out of the industry to private companies, has turned a blind eye to rolling stock companies, because that's actually where the money is going. And certainly the RMT and ASLEF are recommending to Labour that they do deal with that. But again, Rachel Reeves doesn't want to pay £6 billion or whatever it is to bring them back into public ownership.
But doesn't that give a bit of a lie to this claim by Keir Starmer? So he said, visiting the Hitachi factory in the north of England, that this plan would end the boom and bust of the industry, effectively meaning that they would control the ordering of new trains. But that can't be the case. If they're not going to take back control of the rolling stock contracts and the renewal of the fleets, then they can't end this boom and bust. I might say he was visiting a factory that I had the privilege when I was Northern Powerhouse Minister of actually cutting the ribbon when they first turned the first sod to build it, because of the trains that we ordered during our time in government together.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, what a government can do, and which I have to say the present government hasn't done very successfully, is to have a sensible pipeline of orders. So we don't have boom and bust on the rolling stock. We have predictable orders, and we don't have factories like the one in Derby having to work overtime some years and then facing new orders the next year. But ultimately, the rolling stock companies can decide what they want to build themselves. And what I think they will do, because this is commercially in their interest to do so, is always to have a dearth of supply. They will never have quite enough trains, which will help pushing up the cost of those who do have. But it's obviously supply and demand. They'll milk that.
Well, Norman Baker, former Transport Minister in the Coalition Government, thank you so much for joining us. Love hearing from you there.